Almost every CHRO in a less sophisticated organization is working on the same problem. They need their CEO to understand what HR is capable of. But here's the issue. CEO awareness is the variable that gets attention. CHRO terrain clarity is the variable that gets results.
Hey there, senior leader, and welcome to the Talent Sherpa podcast. This is where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. I'm your host, Jackson Lynch, and today I am joined by my co-host, my friend Scott Morris. He's a former CHRO with a scar tissue to prove it, who was told 4 quarters running that his talent roadmap was great, and we're going to circle back when things settle down, and the founder of Propulsion AI. That's my favorite part of the whole bit. Today we're going to be talking about a gap that I think rarely gets named in the room where it lives. Here's the reality. A large portion of CHROs are operating in companies where the CEO measures HR success by whether the trains are running, and a lot of very talented people have spent years waiting for the CEO to evolve. Today, we're going to make the case that waiting is the wrong move. The episode today is about clarity and the CHRO's own terrain clarity and what to do with it.
Yeah, that picture hits hard, Jackson. If you've lived it, especially, and I know I have. I've been really fortunate to be with CEOs who really get it and are really sophisticated, and I've been on the other end of it too. And I've also watched where the most capable HR leader that I'd ever worked alongside was running a playbook that the CEO just wasn't ready for, and they paid for it. And I've been in a room where a different CHRO was doing something that was harder to name. They were moving the people agenda forward in ways that the CEO could feel without making the CEO feel left behind. And that's the skill that this episode's all about. But before we get into it, let's just take a second to say thank you to some listeners. A shout out this week to Will from Dallas. Thanks for being a part of the community, Will. It means something real that you're here. And to everybody who is listening to us today, whether you're joining us from Crop in, I knew I wasn't going to be able to say this name without reading it, Schleichwig, Holstein, or an easier one for me, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. We're really glad you showed up for today.
And I'm especially glad that the folks from Germany joined it so that Scott, who has made fun of my inability to pronounce some of the names of our listeners, the cities that they listen from, so Scott can get a little taste of our own medicine.
But I'm very thankful for our German audience, and I'm very sorry that my pronunciation isn't better.
We're actually quite big in Germany. And I'll tell you what, this community, and it's the thing that I think is so dang cool, it's been building itself into a group of people who are actually doing the work differently and not just talking about it. So thank you, Will, and thank you to everyone who keeps showing up twice a week.
Yeah, and let's take another 30 seconds since we're stopped here and we haven't gone, because I want to talk about this thing that you've built that is really catching fire right now. And let me just say to people who are listening, think about a performance problem that you're focused on right now. And now ask yourself, is that a person problem, or is it the system around the person and how that system is designed? That's the question that a lot of CHROs answer wrong in real time, and it costs them. And Jackson's built this thing called the CHRO Ascent Academy, and it's built specifically to close that gap. One graduate of the program designed the organizational design module as immediately relevant and something that they applied in that same week. And that's the kind of program that Jackson delivers. It's practical, it's at the right altitude, and it's designed to deliver results for you. Seats are limited in this program. You should check it out. You can find it at mytalentsherpa.com. And you should get there quick because the seats go really fast when he opens a cohort.
Yeah, we're really excited. I've been in the process of doing the final interviews for the folks that will be participating. We have sitting CHROs. We have folks that have been in the chair at least twice now. This will be their third time that as they're moving into it. And they're still coming in because we can add value to them, and it's great. So everything starts on June 12th is what the current calendar looks like. So really appreciate that, Scott. Let's get into today's episode. Here's, I think, the picture that a large share of CHROs are actually working inside right now. Gartner You've, of course, heard of them. They have a CHRO survey, and that data consistently shows that fewer than 1 in 3 CHROs report having the CEO alignment that they need to execute their full people agenda. Incidentally, that number has not moved meaningfully in several years. And a significant portion of CEOs describe HR as important, but fundamentally transactional. That's something that either runs well or it doesn't run well, but it's not something that shapes the business decision before it gets made. And all of that put together creates a gap between the role that most CHROs are prepared to play and the one that they are actually invited into. And I don't think that's new, but what's different now is where the pressure is landing in this environment in this moment.
You know what I've seen inside organizations is a pretty clean dividing line. In companies where HR was operating as a strategic lever and the CHRO was in the room when business architecture decisions were being made, go-to-market restructures, capability builds ahead of new markets, succession treated as risk management rather than an HR planning exercise, right? That's one. And, in other companies, HR is still in the service delivery lane. The CHRO is being brought in after big decisions are being made, after the reorganization was decided, after the acquisition closed, after the executive hire went sideways, right? The problem was baked by the time that HR had any visibility into it. And it's two sort of different ways that I think HR exists right now in business.
I think that's right. And from my view, the organizations that have performed most effectively over the last couple of years had real executional discipline, and they had the right people in the key roles, clear decision rights, accountability systems that were more than a word on a poster. They really defined for reliability and asked the question, what has to be true for us to be able to execute at a high level? And then you flip that against the organizations that have struggled. They had a strategy in most cases. The organization just couldn't absorb. McKinsey, by the way, has done some research on high performing talent systems. And what they found is that companies where HR operates at a design function outperform peers roughly 2 times on revenue per employee over 5 years. Like, that's a real number. The separator in case after case after case is whether the people function is a lever or a support beam. Technology spend and capital structure show up on both sides of that line.
Yeah, I like that too. Is that your term, support beam, or is that McKinsey's?
No, I think I just came up with that.
I like that. I mean, I think the thing that makes it hard to interrupt is that the CHROs who are working in that support beam scenario, they're often doing really, really good work. I mean, it's not easy to get the trains to run on time. They're cleaning up effectively. Execution is at a high level and they get recognized for it. Which creates a picture of success that looks indistinguishable from a ceiling. And you can't see the ceiling from inside the lane you're in. And that's a problem.
It is. And there's something I've seen in my own advisory work, and I think you just named it really precisely. I've sat with CHROs who could not tell whether they're valued or utilized. Let me say it again. Valued or utilized. Both feel like successes from the inside. The CEO was not doing anything wrong under whatever his or her model was. They had a HR function that delivered, and they didn't know that they needed anything different. And I think that's something that most of us have felt, if not at some point in our careers, then often over the course of our careers.
I mean, as I look back over my own career, I've been that person. I was effective in a role and had broad support, and the business was moving, and I was nowhere near the conversation that was actually shaping the next chapter, even though I, I was getting credit for doing the job really well. I had built a picture of contribution that was accurate on its own terms and invisible to the problem that actually mattered. And I think that's the gap that you and I are going to try and map in this episode.
Yeah. And I want to take a second here and just talk a little bit about the importance of mandate clarity, because we're going to assume in the course of this episode that you are creating a mandate that is aligned with where the function needs to go. That is the ideal scenario. Okay. But there's also a reality that the only thing that you can't have is guesswork around what the clarity is. Okay. So figuring out between you and the CEO where you need to be with clarity such that I think I wrote a couple of weeks now ago on LinkedIn, if two people can't describe the mandate in two sentences or less, the CEO and the CHRO, like start there because you at least need to understand today where you are before you take the next step. My alcoholic family members would say the first step is to admit you have a problem. I would take the same thing and apply it here. First step is to know exactly where you are, and only from that point can you move it. But I also want to be really double down on this point. CEO awareness is not a variable that a CHRO can control. And sometimes we think we can. The CEO is doing exactly what a CEO in execution mode does. There's nothing wrong with it. They are relying on the function that's working the way it's currently defined. That is normal. The variable in the CHRO's own control is the clarity about the terrain and about the constraints and about the specific next step that begins to build a different pattern without triggering the immune response that kills the initiative before it lands. So I want to name a couple wrong turns that I think make this harder than it looks because they point in completely opposite directions, and both I think are easy to end up inside. Now, the first is what I think of as the upper arm of the problem. These are the CHROs who have done the work. They read the research, they've been to the conferences, they listen to the Talent Sherpa podcast, and they know what a world-class people strategy looks like. They might even know what strategy means. They arrive with a framework, they start building it out, and within 18 months, they're seen as disconnected from the business. Not because their thinking's wrong, but because it arrived faster than the organization could absorb it.
It's so funny. So I did a program at Harvard with Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky, and it was on adaptive leadership. And one of the things that I remember starkly in that program was their view that leadership is about frustrating a system at a rate that it can absorb. And I think that's really interesting. And I think that's a part of what you just named. The career outcome that follows is worth naming here because it's counterintuitive, right? The CHRO most prepared for a strategic role is often the one that's most at risk in a less sophisticated environment that isn't ready for them because the system rewards what it already recognizes. And what a CEO in execution mode is recognizing or wants to recognize is operational reliability. Run the trains. When the CHRO is talking, strategic people architecture and the CEO is focused on the next quarter's execution plan, the CHRO isn't wrong. But that's the problem, right? They're operating at a frequency that the organization can't yet receive. And you don't get fired because your ideas are bad. You get fired because nobody can connect your work to what's mattering right now. And that's a different problem and it calls for a different response.
Scott, I've been that person. And I don't know if you have. Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, the reason
Yeah.
the reason I ask
100%.
that okay. The silence for anyone listening on the podcast is Scott nodding, forgetting that we do audio. but
The six people that watch us on YouTube actually saw my reaction.
that is not way more than. And by the way, we are now on video on Apple. In case you want to
That's right.
ruin a good meal, you can watch us while you eat. Uh,
You can watch
anyway,
me silently nod.
like, hello, we're on a podcast. Anyway, the reason I'm asking is I think the honest answer to that question is where the diagnosis stops being abstract. It's a different conversation when you actually have lived that out.
I've totally been that person. I mean, you know me, and I'm pretty open about this. I've had more failures than I've had successes. I've learned most of the lessons the hard way. There was a stretch role where I was proud of the talent framework that I built. I came to understand more gradually than I should have that the CEO uh, couldn't describe what was in it. And that's a huge problem. And it wasn't because he was uninvested. It's because I had designed it with this level of sophistication that the organization didn't need yet. And it was brilliant from my point of view. It just wasn't helpful for that situation, and context matters. And, I built a 4-level architecture on a 1-level foundation, I think, and I expected it to hold, and it didn't.
Yeah. So one of the challenges of people who grew up in the PepsiCo organization, which is largely recognized as being one of the academy HR environments. I was talking to a guy earlier today who was an alumni as well. We were ruminating about this. is we think that everything that works at Frito or Pepsi is going to work every place. And the reality is you got to be the business where it is. And uh, Frito has such strong decision rights, role clarity, and built in kind of you know, who is accountable for what. And the system is built so reliably that it kind of doesn't matter who is in the seat, the system is still going to run. And then you try to take that same and you apply it in other places. And I've done this earlier, my CHRO assignments, and you realize, oh, here are the four things that I assumed to be true that turned out not being true. So I've gotten smarter over the years, right? And I was talking to a CEO earlier this week, and he said, "Well, what do you think the right people scorecard looks like?" And of course, I walked him through the talent scorecard that we talked about. But I got a little smarter at the end, and I said, but I also realized that might be 3 steps farther than where you guys are today, which means one of the things that working together I'd like to co-create is what is the farthest path forward towards that end that the organization's ready for. And I'm not inside the organization today. I haven't worked with this group as a client before, but once we get in, we can figure out what that is together. And that doesn't mean that I'm being intellectually, I'm not caving in. All I'm doing is the smart play of recognizing if I move this organization too far too fast, it's going to blow everything up. Well, I think the second wrong turn then is this. I'm going to call it a mirror image. The CHRO who sees what happened to the person above him and then makes the rational adjustment. And look, you see this very much in sports coaching, right? If you have a manager that's a player's coach, the next person that gets hired after they fire that guy happens to be a disciplinarian, and the pendulum goes back and forth. So in what that means for us is I see I'm going to be very operationally excellent. I'm going to earn their trust through execution. I'm going to introduce the strategic agenda from a position of credibility because the last person just tried to cram it through. And look, I don't think that logic is wrong. And I think importantly, it probably keeps you employed for longer. But what happens is that execution loop then starts to pull and you get better at it. You get recognized for it and the rewards build, and the runway to everything beyond execution gets longer and longer every quarter. And 3 years in, the ceiling is still operational reliability. And now you're also the person that everybody calls when the system breaks, right? So, leaving that lane at some point becomes, well, it feels like it's a risk because every signal the environment is sent is pointing right back to it.
You're an old movie fan. Have you seen the movie What About Bob?
With Bill Murray, Richard Dreyfuss, baby steps up on the bus, baby steps down the hall, baby steps to blowing up the building. Yeah,
That's
love that movie.
exactly the one. And I think that's the right frame here, right? That character is taking small steps towards something. And I think that's the frame that works here too. The key insight is that a baby step isn't a compromise. It's a method, and it's how you move the terrain especially I think in a less sophisticated organization that isn't ready for strategic HR. That's how you move it forward. Little baby steps towards something. The larger movement is going to get rejected, but a series of smaller ones won't. The CHRO in the execution lane isn't failing. They're on a path, though, that has no natural exit ramp. And that's what you're trying to create with those baby steps. And so that's the work. Use the baby steps to find where that exit, where that path begins, and let that path take you to a different level of HR, not just the execution, but the strategy. And you're doing that as the organization slowly becomes able to absorb more.
Yeah, you mentioned Bill Murray. Now I'm thinking through. There is a video of him going back to Ireland and singing all the Irish folk songs in the pubs. If you have not seen that and you're Irish like me, or if you just like beer, or Bill Murray, that is such a wonderful video. I'd highly recommend it. But I will, coming back to this, both I think of those traps share the same structural root, and that's what we need to get to as we move on next. So here's what I think is the mechanism underneath both of those wrong terms, because the fix people typically reach for they treat the symptom. They don't touch the loop that's producing it. So maybe, Scott, let me ask you, when you were inside the role where the architecture that you had built wasn't being absorbed, like what was running underneath that immune response? Because I think what you described from the inside is probably more useful than any structural diagram.
Well, I think there was sort of a self-reinforcing loop, but I mean, to borrow your term, on each arm of the problem, right? The loops pulled in opposite directions. On the upper arm, the over elevated strategic play, the loop kind of looks like this. You go up the K, you start talking strategy. The CEO doesn't, connect your work to what's in front of him. You get excluded from operational decisions because you seem less relevant in that lane. And so you try and go further up the K, looking for the space where your ideas are going to get some traction, which takes you further from the operating reality of the business, which makes you harder to connect to it, which that's the loop that starts to pull you away from the business. The CEO was expecting me to be more operational, and I was trying to go the other direction, and that's where the disconnect.
Yeah, I think that the loop on the lower arm is the exact mirror. So think about a K. What Scott just talked about was the line going up, and I'm going to talk about the line going down. And in this case, you stay in execution mode. You solve problems. The CEO appreciates it. You get pulled into more operational decisions. You solve more problems. The system teaches you that this is where your value lives. And every reward signal that I've seen points down the K. The idea of stepping up starts to feel like you're abandoning the thing that makes you trusted. And that's hard. And the loop reinforces that lane so strongly. And, you know, both lanes or both arms have their own gravity and they're pulling hard. The pull towards execution is not laziness, in my view. It is what rational actors do when the environment consistently rewards one behavior and penalizes the alternative in the moment. The question is what happens over time.
And it feels like it's a no-win scenario. Whether you're going up the K or down the K, right? You go down the K and you're getting pulled into more of the stuff that you're trying to get away from so you can do strategic HR. And when you're trying to go up the K, you're getting farther away from how everybody else perceives that you're adding value, and then you're disconnected. And it's just a no-win.
So there is a third path, and we're going to cleverly title this the middle path. I use the same PR firm that Scott did for Get Propulsion AI. Look, it if you go down the middle of it really is the structural heart of the problem. There is no organizational gravity that pulls towards it. Every environmental signal points at one arm or the other. And once you move into that, it pulls you into all sorts of harm. So the only way to get to that middle ground is to build it yourself. And I think you build it by reinforcing rather than letting the environment choose for you. And let me open up and talk about what the frame is that I use with my clients on kind of. I think it changes the way the whole problem works. A common pattern among CHROs in less sophisticated operating environments is diagnosing the wrong constraint. So they assume the constraint is the CEO's development. Because otherwise, if I could develop the CEO, he would or she would let me go build the HR world that I know is what the business needs. And look, I get it. Like if the CEO could see the full potential of what we are capable of, the organization would elevate with it. And that framing produces two strategies: waiting or educating. Both are slow. Neither, in my view, can be effective. And most importantly, neither are in the CHRO's control.
Yeah, well, it's not that they're not effective, but you're definitely right. They are not usually within your control. But what is the variable that's actually in their control? I think a lot of people in the CHRO seat have been so focused on the CEO as the lever that they've stopped looking anywhere else. And it makes sense because the CEO feels like it's the only variable that matters, right? So that's the one that they're working on.
Yeah. This constraint in as you frame that is the CHRO's own clarity about the terrain. And, to make sure I'm clear, the clarity around terrain has a very specific meaning here. It means knowing three things about this organization at this stage of its life cycle right now.
What are the three? Because I think we ought to double click on that because I think a lot of people will nod at terrain clarity and think that they already have that. But the specificity is going to help. So why don't you name the three?
Yeah, and I use this, by the way, as I'm working with my clients on how to develop a people strategy. And so if anyone has seen kind of the work that I do in this space, I think this will become familiar. If not, I'm happy to work with you. The first is to talk about the external business environment. And I'm not talking about the annual report version, but like the real operating reality the CEO's losing sleep over. You learn that by sitting with the CEO, the CFO, the line leaders fighting for revenue and asking what is hardest right now, not with HR, not with the agenda, but with curiosity about the terrain the business is actually standing on. The second is understanding the external talent marketplace. And that's you're trying to understand where is the supply and demand equation broken for the roles that most drive results. That's tied to the talent optimization portfolio work that I talked about a lot. Like, where is the risk building that this company hasn't seen yet because it's too focused in on what's right in front of it operationally to look up from the work? And then the third is a real no BS view of the current state of human capital, not what you wish it were, not the programs that you're running, but if you think about all of the constraints and the sophistication level of your human capital system, like as CHRO, you've got to know exactly what reality looks like on the ground.
The third one I think we should press on a little bit because I think it's the one that I've seen filtered most often, and the filtering is where the whole strategy breaks down. The first two are external and they feel a little bit safer. The third one requires us as HR leaders to look at our own house, and I think that's where a lot of CHROs tend to stop.
Like, I think the third one is the hardest because it requires an honest assessment of the state of human capital inside this organization. And calling balls and strikes on something that you helped co-create can feel like failure, or it might feel like you're setting yourself up to assume blame. I get it. That's a natural reaction. Fight through it. As a architect, you've got to understand where you are on the field. And you know, I'm not talking about here's what I'd like us to do. This isn't what we're good at as HR. I mean, like the overall state of human capital. Like if you were going through a diligence process and you had an interview with a private equity operator doing diligence, they would ask you about gaps named, risks named, bright spots named, like execution issues, the picture that makes the problem legible, not the picture that makes the function look good.
Well, and when we talk about the first two, like the external business environment, talking about that, even the hard parts of that, that's not threatening. And talking about the talent market and the ups and downs and goods and bads, that's not threatening. But an honest internal assessment is where the temptation to kind of protect the function shows up. And I think especially for, if you're in an organization where HR isn't as valued as highly, then I think it gets even harder to have that honest, assessment. And I mean, I know you have as well. I've certainly been in rooms where the CHRO had done the first two, really well in terms of being able to assess them and be articulate about them. But then the third one, gets kind of soft and squishy, and what comes out is a reality that doesn't exist. And when it didn't land, the interpretation was that the CEO wasn't sophisticated enough to receive it, and that's just the wrong diagnosis.
Yeah, and I want to push back on something you said though, because it's important, I think, and that is you said an HR community that is not valued as highly. That has an assumption of how it should be valued, and that's the assumption I would push on. What you have there is a mandate clarity difference between what you think value should be defined as and what your CEO does. That doesn't mean that the CEO doesn't value you high. It could be that it is more likely that it is just a definitional challenge between where you think you should be and where they are. It could be a low altitude mandate, and the CEO could highly value that. That puts you in a position where you need to you know, either figure out the baby steps to move forward, or perhaps that's not the right seat for you.
Yeah, I mean, let me clarify my point then, because what I meant by that was, I make an assumption that most of the people that listen to us are wanting to help their organization step forward into increasingly more strategic HR pursuits rather than just run the trains. I think I would assume that of most of our listeners, right? And there are organizations where that is easier to do, where the terrain has been laid out. The CEO does have a recognition. The CHRO has led the baby steps necessary to start building to where the organization can do some more strategic things. And there are organizations that haven't. And that's all I meant. That, the CHRO wants it, but the organization isn't ready for it yet. That's what I meant by it doesn't value you as much.
Yeah, and like, I'm not arguing your good intentions here. What I want to point out for the listeners is the there's a challenge in assuming that because I'm not doing the work I know I'm capable of doing for the organization, that the CEO doesn't value me. That may be true,
Yeah.
okay?
That's not
But
my point.
I didn't think so, but it can be easily, I think, interpreted that way. What I'm trying to reinforce here is you need to know what your CEO expects out of the function. And you need that clarity on the mandate, because only with that stage, without the uh the garnish of they don't value me. No, they value you for something other than what you think they should value for. That's not a semantic difference. And if you take it off, here's what they value me for, great. Now you have a better baseline from where you are to move forward. If it is they don't value what I do, like, where's your starting place in that world?
Right. That's
Okay.
that's time to look.
Potentially, or it's time to get the mandate clarity that is required for you to, I think, do any of this work. And look, we hit on the third one a lot, and it's important because, uh, well, but once you hold all three simultaneously, you can identify the constraint that, if you relax it even a little bit, can produce a result that the CEO can feel. So that's the baby step, not a, it's not a full strategic transformation. It's a constraint relaxation, small enough for the organization to absorb and very specific enough to produce a signal the CEO can then connect to the business outcome. And then if you keep doing that over and over and over, that's how you expand expectations of what the CEO expects out of the function.
Well, and you just named the cure for the failure that I had when it was mine, right? That connection, that the CEO feeling the result, is what I missed in the time where I just did it wrong. I was building things that were architecturally rigorous and experientially invisible, I think. And the CEO, didn't feel them because I had designed for the ideal organization rather than the actual. And when I started asking a different question, and I tell you all the time, I've had to fight my way out of my own mistakes. But when I recognized it and asked a different question about what I could, relax in the next 90 days that would produce something this specific CEO would feel in the business, that's when the whole picture started to change. And not the destination that I was moving toward, but certainly the sequence that I was pursuing for getting.
And let me also kind of reinforce something that's important for everyone to listen. Life isn't what you see on Facebook and Instagram. CHROs, every place, are struggling with what Scott just named. Scott's lived it. I've lived it. I don't know another CHRO who has any self awareness that hasn't lived through this. So I appreciate, you know, Scott, you shared that. I hope to share kind of my career toe stubs at the same time, but it's really important to know you're not alone. Life is not the highlight that you see on Instagram, or whatever, the current social media that I try to avoid is, right. It is like, this is gritty stuff, and that's why building a community of people who are thinking through this, I think, is important. I also think it's why a reframe is important rather than talking about it as a tactic, because it changes the causation model. Like the old model says the CEO has to evolve before the CHRO can operate at altitude. The new model says the CHRO has to build the brand new reinforcing loop first by relaxing one constraint in a way the organization can absorb, and the CEO's awareness will follow with the evidence. And you're building the conditions under which that permission becomes available. It's an orientation shift that allows that allows that allows permission to follow evidence, and evidence is what you're building.
Baby steps for certain, not because you're compromising the vision that you have, but because the baby step is the method. Baby steps build the loop that eventually makes the bigger steps possible. And so, if we take anything away from the fictional movie, what about Bob? Doesn't teach you to play small forever. It teaches you that the movement through a resistant system requires matching the step size to how the system is, currently capable of absorbing them. And the step sizes grow and the loop runs, and that's how the path gets built.
So let's talk now about how a CHRO can start moving on this starting this week. I think the play one here is the terrain read. 3 diagnoses that are run simultaneously before anything else. First, sit down with the CEO, the CFO, and the line leaders fighting for revenue and say, what is hardest right now? And make sure it's linked up to the business's strategy. Now, and that meeting is not to report back on HR's work. Okay. It's really one directional. It's to understand the terrain the business is really standing on. Second is take a look at the external talent marketplace. Where is the supply and demand equation broken for the roles that most drive results? What are the employee expectations that we're not currently delivering? What is the risk building that the company hasn't seen yet? And then the third is the honest, no BS internal assessment of the current state of human capital, built in a way a private equity operator doing diligence would want to see it. Gaps named, risks named, bright spots named, and no assignment of blame, but a real balls and strikes, because you got to, first step is to admit you have a problem, and then you can do something about it.
Well, and I think when you look at all three of those together, I think the constraint starts to show itself in a way that it doesn't if you were to look at any of them separately, right? The overlap is where the real picture lives.
I think that's right. And maybe the way to think about it is when all 3 reads are in view simultaneously, the constraint is just going to pop out. And you'll see the friction point that if you were to relax it, changes what's possible with the CEO in this moment in this company. And that specificity is what makes the next move more concrete than conceptual.
So that's play one. Play two is restructuring the CEO one-on-one. And I think a lot of CHROs use whatever time they get with their CEO to report on HR and on what's happened and what's in progress and what's coming in their projects and their programs and those kinds of things. And I don't want to be dismissive of that, because they do have those things are necessary and they do have their place. But that format, even when it's executed well, kind of confirms the CEO's model of HR as a service function, which is not where you want it to be. The restructured one-on-one has 3 parts. Part 1 is still the tactical update. Keep that short, 5 minutes. The trains are running. Here are the things that the CEO really needs to know. And what they really need to know is there are no fires, right? Boom, short. Part 2 is the business interpretation. So when, in play 1, you developed an understanding of the terrain. Here, you want to bring one read from that terrain diagnostic and offer it as a hypothesis. Here's what I'm seeing in the market for the roles that matter most to our growth agenda. And here's what I think this means for our next decision, because this is what's holding us back. That's a different kind of meeting to have with your CEO.
Yeah, tell me where I have that wrong. That's the question. That framing is going to shift. You're not reporting. You are thinking with the CEO rather than reporting to him.
And actually, I like your use of that question. Tell me where I have it wrong, because that's inviting the conversation, and it's going to naturally progress from there. So let me do part 3 here. Now, part 3 is one question, not a list. One, what's the thing that is keeping you up right now that has a human capital dimension. And I think you have to be like, I don't like my framing of that. I think I got the point right, but I didn't frame it right because you don't want them to be talking about a people problem. You want them to talk about a business problem that has a people component to it. And if you're asking that question consistently over time, that's going to surface the real constraint faster than a lot of the other diagnostic work. And I think it does something else. It signals to your CEO that you're thinking about his or her problems, not just the problems of your function.
Yeah, and let me offer a suggestion back to play number one, which is to kind of do the update. What I do, and it's a pain in the butt, but I think with AI you can probably do it more efficiently already than when I was doing it. You write down all the updates and you send it in advance, and you say which one of these do I actually want to talk about. Because oftentimes we spend the most valuable thing we have, which is airtime with the boss, to talk about stuff that doesn't need a decision and might not even need a discussion. So the solution to that is you write it down, you send it, and play one. Part one of that is what is it you want to talk about that I shared that needs more discussion. And if there's a decision, you write down there that there's a decision, and then you go to that one before you move on to number two. Play three, I think is important, and I love the way you kind of reframed it as just ask what's keeping what the CEO thinks is keeping them up at night. You don't need to include the 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 people component to it. That's your job to figure out what that is, right? That's how we ask the questions. But once you get that train read and the CEOs in the analysis with you, it's really through questions you can identify the one constraint that you can do something about in the next 60 to 90 days that would produce a result that the CEO can feel. Like small enough to absorb, specific enough that the CEO can connect the outcome back to the action that you took. And ideally, you guys have co-created what that thing is. That connection, as you do that right, becomes a new self-reinforcing loop.
Well, and you know what else it does is that loop, it's not just a tactical win, but it recalibrates what the CEO believes that HR is capable of. And that recalibration is the permission that the next step needs.
And once that loop runs, I think you've earned the right to stretch the next constraint just a little bit further. And the CEO's evidence base is going to build, and your own clarity about the organization's absorption capacity builds. And over time, each relaxation is a little larger than the one before, and the confidence builds on both sides. And you're not compromising the vision. You are building the path towards running the train that you can actually, you know, walk through. So, okay, senior leaders, this is your favorite part of the pod. It's the Talent Sherpa summary, and as Scott always says, I have an extremely sophisticated talent architecture. I am simply waiting for the organization to become the organization that needs it.
I've never said that. Oh my God. I don't know where you come up with these. All right, here we go. Takeaway one. The sophistication gap is real, right? Not all CEOs get it the way you need them to get it, but it's not the CEO's problem to solve. A large number of organizations still measure HR success by execution reliability, headcount, filled, compliance, no fires, like all of that stuff. It's the environment that you're working in. Operating as if you're in a different one isn't going to change or accelerate that evolution, but it might get you replaced by somebody who delivers on the model that the CEO had in mind. So you're going to have to work two things at once. Takeaway two: K-shape is a diagnostic, it's not a judgment. But the lower arm, the execution focus, describes one way that the system works and one way that people survive inside of it. And the upper arm, coming up the K, disconnected strategy, describes what happens when the kind of a step size exceeds the organization's current ability to absorb it. And both arms have reinforcing loops, and neither loop points toward the middle path. And you have to build that path directly and deliberately. Takeaway three: train comes before strategy, right? You got to read the train first, the external business environment, the external talent marketplace, and you have to be willing to do an honest internal assessment. And held simultaneously, they help you identify the real constraint, not the one that you wish the business had, the one it actually has. And once you can name it, you can decide what to relax. Takeaway four and the last one: baby steps are a method, they're not a retreat. You're not compromising. The constraint relaxation that produces a result that a CEO can feel is not a step back from the vision that you have for HR or for the business or for how human capital works. It's how you're going to build your new reinforcing loop. Each loop that runs successfully increases the organization's capability to absorb a new one, and you can let your step sizes grow over time. That's architecture.
And here's what I want people to carry out of this conversation. Like, there is a version of this episode that sounds like advice to be patient or to settle or not to make waves. That's not the argument. The argument is that the method for building altitude in a less sophisticated system is different from the method for operating inside an already sophisticated one. And the reality is most people are in the first. The destination stays the same. The path there is what changes. And the path is built by reading the terrain clearly, naming the constraint honestly, and taking the baby step the organization can actually absorb. And that step builds the loop, and the loop builds permission, and the permission builds the very next step. And that's it for today. I just want to say thank you so much for tuning into the Talent Sherpa podcast. This is where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. And this is so much fun to do with all y'all.
If you like today's episode, do us a favor and hit the like button right now, or even better yet, subscribe to the podcast. You might even leave us a review, whether you're using Apple Podcasts, which you now have video on, or Spotify or YouTube. We're on all of those. It benefits the community and it helps activate the algorithm, which helps spread the pod to other senior leaders who need to hear new ideas about how to become more effective. So hit the like button, drop us a review, even subscribe if you want to right now.
That would be awesome. And I want to take a minute to talk about Scott's company. Propulsion AI is workforce intelligence for private equity. Their AI teammates are surfacing workforce risk before close, and then they help leadership teams drive execution after the close. They translate that strategy into individual accountability. They coach managers to define roles by outcomes with cool tools underneath, and they give every employee a clear line of sight to what actually works. If you've listened to one episode, or this is, I think, episode 138, we talked about mandate clarity and outcome clarity up front. That's what Scott's company does. It's all good stuff, and it's all through artificial intelligence. You can learn more at the very cleverly named getpropulsion.ai.
Thanks, Jackson. And, if you're a new CHRO or you're preparing to step into a CHRO role, Jackson has built tools that are going to help you to operate at the altitude that the role demands. Personal coaching. I talked a little bit about Jackson's Ascent Academy, CHRO Ascent Academy at the top of the episode, even his best-selling Substack. You can find everything that you need at mytalentsherpa.com.
Hey, thank you, Scott. And thank you for everyone who is listening. And until next time, keep raising the bar. Name the constraint before you draw the architecture, and keep on climbing.